Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University, and I'm recording this talk that I'm going to be giving at the DEAC conference next week in case other people want to share it with their colleagues. So just to tell you a little bit about my background in City Vision University, in many ways, City Vision University is the faith-based counterpart to University of the People. Our tagline is radically affordable education to make a living and a life. And just to give you a little bit of my background, before coming to City Vision, I had previously co-founded MIT's Internet Telephony Consortium with one of the fathers of the Internet, and that was focused on disrupting the telecommunications industry. And I used that expertise in disruptive innovation to work as a consultant to Sprint and venture capitalists and a lot of Internet startups. But since then, I've spent the past 20 years living among the poor and using disruptive innovation for education, largely to educate lower income communities. And in January of this year, we recently announced a $2,000 associate's degree total cost and a $5,000 bachelor's degree path partnered with Saylor Academy. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is really talk about what disruptive innovation means for DEAC schools. It's a term that's thrown around a lot. Most people who use it don't actually know what it means, but I'm going to start off and give a little bit of background on disruptive innovation theory. So one of the best examples of disruptive innovation is the computer industry, where you started off with mainframes that ultimately they got disrupted by PCs. And what happens is you, whenever disruption happens, often you will have 10 times as many users at a tenth or less of the cost, and that's what happened with mainframes and PCs. And then now PCs are being disrupted with mobile. Many people, including the person who coined the term disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen, is now saying that higher education is going through a disruption. And I would say that that also has similar waves where you had traditional higher education, and then the first wave of disruption was a bunch of different things: online education, for-profit higher education, community college, traditional higher education in emerging markets. And many DEAC schools were kind of the forerunners of online education with the focus on correspondence. But now I think that there is another wave of expansion that's going to come that I'm calling adaptive competency-based education ecosystems. And it's going to be focused on emerging markets. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I think about that, what that looks like in the remaining slides. So the slide that's most used to explain what disruptive innovation theory is basically you'll have different tiers, and these different colored lines, low quality use might be, very low end community colleges, and high quality use might be high end schools. But the idea is that a disruptive technology comes and it starts off and the quality isn't that great, but gradually it gets better. So an example would be the first digital cameras, where the first digital cameras, you could barely even see what the pictures were. But now the best digital cameras are, even the digital cameras that I have in my iPhone is much more useful to me than any film camera that I ever bought. And there's other industries that have been disrupted. So travel agents, Netflix versus Blockbuster, newspapers, e-readers. And what's happening is online education, I would say, is somewhere between low quality use and medium quality use. And what that means is that a lot of the lower quality campuses are closing. But if the theory holds true, then what you'll do is you'll see online education and digital education gradually improving in quality. So another way of looking at this is with the term innovation extension. So this is just showing some of the previous curves in a different way. But as you have a new technology, eventually the adoption peaks. And then you have to do what's called an innovation extension to really ride the next wave. So a good example of this is PC peaked, and right around the time they were peaking, Apple actually did a really good job, and they saw that was peaking, so they invested in the iPod. And then they saw that the iPod was peaking, and they invested in the iPhone. And the question is, can Apple keep having these innovation extensions? But the same type of things happened in higher education. So you had traditional higher education, which is the first wave, and in many ways, I think that has peaked. And then now you're having what I would call traditional online education, and that's starting to reach some of its peak. I think it still has probably another decade left, but then there's going to be a third tier, which I'm calling adaptive competency-based education in emerging markets. You could also look at these different waves in terms of distance education. So for DEAC schools, the first wave was correspondence education, the next wave was traditional online education, and then the third wave is, again, the adaptive competency-based education in emerging markets. And you could also look at the same type of thing in terms of expanding markets. So, the market for distance education was fairly small. But then once you got online education, the market became a lot larger, and I would argue that this adaptive competency-based education is going to make the market even larger. So what do I mean by these three different waves? Let me go and just talk about some of the differences there. So and the three waves would be the correspondence model, the online model, and the adaptive competency-based education. Because I think a lot of DEAC schools can relate to this. Some are still more in the correspondence space, even though they're online. They function more like correspondence. Others are more online with a lot of interaction. And then only a few schools, I think we're just at the beginning of looking at what an adaptive CBE school would look like. And the scale is different. So the biggest difference is the adaptive CBE school would be 100,000 to hundreds of millions. And some examples of this would be, I would say, Duolingo. So they have over 100,000, 130 million users teaching language. Khan Academy is another example that I would say is close to that. And another big difference in the model is the fixed cost. So the fixed cost of a correspondence operation and online operation, I would say, is close to the same. But for these adaptive competency-based systems like Duolingo, you're talking about a much higher, orders of magnitude higher fixed cost. And then the big difference, though, is the per student cost annually. So for correspondence, the cost can be quite low as maybe $100 per student. Online, you're talking between $1,000 and $10,000. But for adaptive competency-based education, for someone like Duolingo who has 130 million users, their cost per user per year is probably less than $1, and probably more like 10 cents. But for some of these vendors, it might be up to $10. But the point is that by having such scale, their cost goes down dramatically. And the other big shift is on the personalization. So for correspondence, you have fixed courses and you don't have very frequent faculty interaction. Online, you have fixed courses and you can have weekly faculty interaction. But for adaptive competency-based education, you have a continuously adaptive course where every answer to every question is changing what comes next. Then you also have unbundled faculty, and I'll talk more about that later. And then the difference in platforms, you have print versus postal. I mean print and postal or ebooks online for correspondence. Then online is primarily a LMS on the web. But for adaptive CBE, it's multi-platform. So going to be primarily mobile devices, but also web, computers, and ultimately those providers are going for a multi-device market. And probably the most significant thing for DEAC schools is to think about how these different models change the core competencies. So for the core competencies in the correspondence space, really it's a publishing model. And there you have to be good at logistics, shipping many books to many people, and good at doing standardized exams, and your content needs to be good book content. Whereas online, you need to be good at managing online programs. You need to be fairly good at technology. You need to be good at online marketing and strong in not just doing book content, but course content. But then for adaptive competency-based education, really you're talking about software development, data analytics, machine learning, and then the content, it's what I'd call atomized, broken up into tiny little modules, and it's going to be best in class, where If Duolingo locks up language, there's not going to be a need for very many other language apps out there. And same thing with Khan Academy and math. And really the other big shift is what's the primary market. So up to now, the primary market for correspondence, online education, and traditional education has been Western countries. But for adaptive competency-based education, it's going to be in Western countries now, but in the long term, it's going to be in developing countries. So what does all this mean? Well, probably the most significant thing that online and adaptive competency-based education, both of those waves, is going to mean is consolidation. So even now, if you look at the consolidation that's happening between traditional education and online education, if you look at how many schools does it take to make up 1/3 of the total enrollment, it takes 222 schools. Whereas in online, it only takes 20 schools to make up 1/3 of the total enrollment. So what this chart shows is it shows the percentage of schools that are in the various categories. So 50% have 3,000 students or more, 26% have 1,000 students to 3,000, and then 24%. So what's going to happen is more and more consolidation is going to happen. And a lot of that is being driven by some of these, the economics, what I said is that the high fixed cost and some of the investment around marketing. So, the question is, where can we automate? And this chart here shows a way to map modes of education. And the left, the vertical axis shows the scalability. So at the top, you have high-tech, low-touch technologies. So that would be static apps, MOOCs, OER, and you could serve millions of users with those. And then as you go down, it gets a little more less scalable. You might have credit by exam, you might have correspondence courses. And this market really has significant fixed cost, but your per student cost is pretty low. And as you go down, your per student cost goes up. Then you get much more hands-on classroom instruction, online courses, and you have fixed cost that might be between $5,000 and $10,000 per course, and the per student cost are $1,000 to $5,000. And ultimately, the holy grail of everything, if we had infinite money, we'd all do face-to-face tutoring, but that just isn't economical. And one of the big advantages of that is that the bottom axis is the pace of personalization. So static apps and MOOC and online education and credit by exam and correspondence courses, you don't customize very quickly. Whereas for other things, it's easier to customize. Face-to-face tutoring can be strong, but even stronger than that is going to be these adaptive systems. So you can have a prior learning assessment portfolio, you can have blended adaptive, and that's the primary way that Khan Academy is used. And then you have what's called mastery learning or competency-based education. So that's Western governors, and then the adaptive CBE ecosystems. And ultimately, what is driving these changes, probably more than anything else, is this bottom part and the top part are following different economic trends. The bottom half here is the costs are going up, and that follows something called Baumol's cost disease. And ultimately, what that disease is about is for things like face-to-face tutoring or teaching, you don't get the dramatic improvements in productivity that you get in other areas. Whereas something like an adaptive system like Duolingo is going to be following Moore's law, and the costs are going to be driven down while the other costs are going to be driven up. So, the question is, what can you automate? And ultimately, it depends on Bloom's taxonomy. So the high level, the more difficult things in Bloom's taxonomy are more difficult to automate. So that's the vertical axis. And the horizontal axis is how subjective the assessment or objective the assessment is. So on the left is objective assessments, and on the right is subjective assessments. So ultimately, lower levels Bloom's, that is objective assessments, is most subject to commoditization and automation. So those are things like math. So that's why Khan Academy is doing so well there. But the subjective assessments with higher level blooms are going to be the hardest to automate. So with all that, the question is, if these changes are happening, what are some recommendations for DEAC schools? So in the face of this, and this is kind of the outline for the second half of my talk, ultimately what you're going to have to do is automate as much as possible while maintaining quality. And in doing that, a key part of that strategy is going to be utilizing unbundling, and learning from Western Governors' strategy is probably the best model out there. And they're doing several things. They're unbundling faculty into specialized roles. They're using unbundled adaptive components when possible, and they're aligning with industry certifications and competencies to improve credential value. And then you also are going to want to develop new strategies for the new environment, just understanding that ultimately, as the market changes, it requires new core competencies and organizational models. And some of that you're going to need to develop more on the international markets, and I'll cover all this. Some other things: lean startup, base of the pyramid. These are some forms of strategy that you can develop, and blue ocean strategy or value innovation. So I'm going to cover all this in the second part of the talk. So unbundling, most of you are familiar with this. One of the best examples is in the computer industry, where it used to be that IBM produced everything, and then the computer industry got unbundled, where Intel produced the chips, Dell would produce the computer, Microsoft produced the operating system, and then you would buy your computer at Best Buy or someplace like that. There's other examples. Netflix is unbundling cable TV, iTunes unbundled albums, online news unbundled newspapers, and there's many other things that unbundle newspapers too. So there's been a lot written about unbundling the university, and one of my favorite papers on this broke up the components of university into 4 components: knowledge acquisition, access to opportunity, metacognition and skills, and transformative experience. So what I'm going to do is kind of go over a model of how people that are unbundling the university are doing that, and what components they're using. So the idea is you take what used to be one entity providing everything, and then what you have is, just like in the computer industry where you have best in class competing at each level, it's the same thing that happens at each level. So for knowledge acquisition, the university might offer content, but students, I talked with someone who was a student at Harvard, and they said that for their math class, they're spending most of their time learning their math using Khan Academy, and they thought, why am I paying Harvard tuition to learn this, math class at Harvard? So increasingly, there's competition with open education, with MOOCs, with various courseware. You can also bring in bundles from alternative education providers like Straighterline, and then in access to opportunity, you can the university can provide the degree, but you're competing with industry certifications, boot camps, staffing agencies, alternative credentials. And then in metacognition and skills, you have other groups: boot camps and accelerators, vocational and trade schools, externships and internships, and portfolio projects. And for the transformative experience, universities, increasingly are seeing competition happening from students going into gap year, or doing a year in AmeriCorps, or study abroad, or a year serving in a religious mission or a congregation. So ultimately, what happens in unbundling is it typically shifts a producer surplus, which is university profits, to consumer surplus. So, look what happened to the record labels with iTunes. Look what's happening to cable, or likely to happen to cable with Netflix. That's kind of the future of universities. Now, as you move through this, part of what's important to realize is that as you go to the bottom here, that's going to be the hardest stuff to automate. So the transformative experience, the metacognition, whereas a lot of the content-based stuff is going to be easiest to automate. So let's look into what this unbundling looks like in the Western Governors model. Ultimately, what they're doing, if you look at them, is they've essentially outsourced much of their lecture and course content as the course content becomes much more like the book market. So they've outsourced a lot of it to McGraw-Hill and Pearson, and they're using paid courseware, and they're using credit by exam or competency evaluation. They also have a strong emphasis on industry certifications and competencies. So if you take a tech degree with Western Governors, you might get 2 or 3 tech certifications that are recognized, Microsoft certification or Cisco certification along the way, and that's going to improve your marketability. But probably the most significant innovation of what they've done is they've unbundled the faculty position into course mentors. So that's essentially the adjunct subject matter expert, and that's what most schools use as the adjunct. But then they've taken out parts of that role. So they have someone else who does the evaluation, who does the assessment. Then they also have student mentors, and the student mentors don't have to have the content expertise, and they stay with the student for their entire academic career. And then you have this new category of the instructional designer. So you have what people are calling the super professor, and requires critical new skills in tech and instructional design. And the big difference is this most highly skilled position, you don't need nearly as many as those as you need, your instructors, your adjuncts. So they'll have 1 course designer and 29 adjuncts. And ultimately what this does is it just makes the whole system more efficient. So we've looked at that and we've said, how do we unbundle and rebundle degrees? And that's how we came up with this $5,000 bachelor's degree. We've taken some of the components from Saylor Academy, which is a online first 2 years of college for free, where you only pay for the exams, and then a portion that City Vision would provide. And ultimately what we've been able to do is provide a $2,000 associate's, $5,000 bachelor's degree. So, what are the unbundled content providers? So say you want to do this. So, there's the courseware providers where you pay. So McGraw-Hill's Learn Smart, Pearson, Course Connect. And that's really, it's like a smart book where you get the courseware with your book. There's course level open educational providers, Saylor Academy, Open University. Then there's what's ACE recognized independent educational providers, and some of those have been reviewed by DEAC and they're approved quality curriculum providers. So Straighterline, Sophia, which is owned by Capella. Then there's a lot of others here, and then there's MOOCs and apps that you could potentially integrate in courses. And there's also a lot of adaptive learning providers. And this is just a quick list of the adaptive learning providers that are out there. And it's important to note that there's 3 categories: the free adaptive platforms, the adaptive content publishers that include content, but then there's others that basically would help you develop your own adaptive system. So that's one of the areas, is unbundling. The other area is looking at really the global opportunity. So if you look at in 2000, there was 100 million students globally. So it took 1,000 years for higher education globally to get to 100,000 students a year. Now by 2025, there's going to be 263 million students. So 163% growth, so more growth in that 25-year period than in the previous 1,000. And 84% of that growth is happening in the developing world. So what that means is 137 million new students in the developing world by 2025. So what do you do with that? Ultimately, what I think you have to do with that is you have to look at a book that's written called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, and there's something called Bottom of the Pyramid Innovation Principles. And really what I'm going to be doing is I'm giving you kind of a survey of some of the material that's out there. But the difference between bottom of the pyramid principle is there's a lot of differences, but probably the most significant is traditional education. As you say, my cost is $4,000, or my cost is $6,000, or my cost is $10,000, and I'm going to have a markup based on that. Whereas the base of the pyramid strategy is you start off with what can the base of the pyramid, what can people in developing countries afford, and then how do you design your product based around that? So some examples are, these new smartphones that are coming out of China, for $20 or $50 for a smartphone coming out of China and India. So, that's a significant thing. And part of what's important to recognize is what's happening in the adoption cycle for post-secondary degrees. So, most people look at the adoption cycle for post-secondary degrees and they just think of the U.S. average and they say, we're around between 30 and 40%. So we're not even halfway through the adoption cycle. But the reality is that higher education isn't a single market, but it's multiple markets with different needs. And, if you're not familiar with this diagram, essentially what it does is it breaks up the people who adopt a new technology. So you have the innovators, the early adopters, and then you have this thing called the chasm. And the chasm is something that basically separates out the people who first pioneer in a space often aren't the ones that innovate in the end. And I think that's something that DEAC schools need to think about, because DEAC schools have been the pioneers. So how are DEAC schools going to be crossing the chasm? And I think that, part of what's happening is the market for post-secondary degrees actually is multiple markets. And you have the top income quartile market, so the top 25%, the next 25%, but then you also have the bottom half and the global average. And for those, you haven't yet crossed the chasm. So I think there's going to be a dramatic change in model that's going to happen with this. So I'm going to give you a few more tools of, how do you adapt. So, traditional education follows what in project management is called the waterfall design, and ultimately what that's about is it's backwards design, and there you have a well-defined problem and you have a known solution. And the idea behind that is that you first spend a lot of time defining your spec, and then you're going to build it, and after a 5-year cycle you might release it and then you get customer feedback. In the software world, there's been something else called Agile, or sometimes called Scrum, where you'll build and release in shorter cycles. So, waterfall is what Microsoft has done with their release of their operating systems every 5 years, whereas Agile is what Facebook does, where they release a new version of their app every 2 weeks. But a different model, and Agile is good where you have a well-defined problem, but an unknown solution. And a different model is lean, and that's where you have a not well-defined problem and an unknown solution. So for instance, how do you provide high quality education to the developing world using adaptive learning? And ultimately what you have to do there is you build, you release, and you get customer feedback, and then you build, you release, and get customer feedback. And that's really what this concept of the lean startup is. And so with the lean startup, basically what you do is you build and you start with a minimum viable product, then you measure, and you get data, and then you learn from that and you do what's called a pivot. And the whole point of the lean startup is what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize your loop iteration speed. So how quickly can you learn is basically the primary value that you have as a company. Now what I believe is organizations increasingly, as these changes happen, they're going to need to learn to have a culture that's going to lean more on this lean startup culture rather than the waterfall design. So that's part of why I'm presenting that. And then the last thing I want to cover is Blue Ocean strategy. For those of you who haven't read the book, the basic idea behind Blue Ocean strategy, sometimes it's called value innovation, is that often what happens is that you get an industry and everyone's competing on the same factors. So that's Orange Airline. Most people in the airline have, about average price, average meals, average lounges, average seating choices, average speed. But what Southwest said is we said, we're going to have very low price, not very good meals, no lounges, not good seating choices, not good hub connectivity, but we're going to compete on some other factors: friendly service, speed, and frequent departure. And what they did is they opened up an entirely new market. And that's part of what is going to be happening with a lot of these new technologies and unbundling, is you can rebundle for a specific market, and in doing that you have to use this strategy. Now, I recognize I really did what I did was a survey of a lot of the concepts in this around disruptive innovation, and I can't really do it justice in a half hour. But what I want to do is I want to kind of, get you interested, and I have a full course that's available on Udemy, iTunes U, YouTube, and SlideShare, and I cover all these topics more in depth. So if you want to go more into these topics, you can, get this course. It's available free online, and also you can download the slides for this presentation online. So thanks a lot.